the Kremlin wants to change the rules of the game again, demanding veto power over security guarantees for Ukraine. The Russians are nullifying the results of all agreements, both in Anchorage and in Washington. Moreover, Russia is not offering any compromises. Their goal is to block any peace initiatives and maintain leverage over both Ukraine and Europe. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, stated that any discussions about security guarantees for Kiev without Russia's participation are a road to nowhere. He categorically rejected the possibility of deploying multinational forces on Ukrainian territory, stating, and I quote, that this is foreign interference and is absolutely unacceptable. Then, he repeated the demands that Moscow had already put forward back in 2022. The Kremlin is only satisfied with a mechanism that would allow Russia and its allies to block any measures of military support for Ukraine. It's clear that in the West, this was seen as sabotage of diplomatic efforts. After all, if Moscow is given veto power, any future agreements would simply lose their meaning.
These demands undermine two major victories achieved by Trump during two consecutive meetings, first with Putin in Alaska on Friday, and then with Zelenskyy and leading European leaders at the White House on Monday. Instead of sticking to the compromise that had been reached, Lavrov tried to revive the old negotiations from the Biden presidency, in which the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, including Russia and China, were proposed as security guarantors for Ukraine. From a New York Post publication.
Russia has long used its veto power as a shield to cover up its own crimes. For example, in the UN, Moscow together with Beijing has blocked any resolutions on investigating crimes in Syria and imposing sanctions against the Assad regime 15 times. Russia prevented the creation of an international tribunal to investigate the MH17 disaster. It blocked the resolution recognizing the illegal annexation of Crimea. And these are just a few examples, and only within the United Nations. But they clearly show how an aggressor country will act if you make concessions to it.
Granting Russia the right to veto Western security guarantees would allow the Kremlin to dictate terms that would weaken Ukraine's ability to resist a new Russian invasion. This would deprive the country of the ability to enter into binding bilateral or multilateral security agreements like those currently being discussed, and would also make it harder to modernize and strengthen its armed forces, as well as to receive support from Ukraine's partners. From the report of the Institute for the Study of War.
Of course, Kiev understands this perfectly well. Moreover, Ukraine does not consider China as a possible security guarantor after the war. As President Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated, Beijing did not help stop this bloodshed from the very beginning. On the contrary, it opened the drone market to Russia, thereby supporting Putin's war machine. The president of Ukraine also reminded that China did not take any steps when Russia occupied Crimea, and, of course, if Russia now gains the right to dictate terms, it will effectively become a co-author of the European security architecture. This means that not only Ukraine, but the entire eastern, and possibly the whole European flank of NATO, will be under constant threat.
This war needs to be brought to an end. We need to put pressure on Russia to end the war. Putin understands nothing but force and pressure. Of course, we are doing and will continue to do everything necessary to protect our state and our people. The President of the United States is absolutely right. This needs to be done not only in defense. At the same time, we are not letting up our diplomatic efforts in all our contacts with partners to ensure that negotiations do take place, specifically, negotiations that can bring peace closer. It is clear that we do not want a repeat of the Budapest Memorandum or the Minsk agreements. We want these guarantees to be effective. Security guarantees for Ukraine will consist of 2 levels. The first level will be the actual establishment of some kind of peace agreement or a ceasefire. On the second level, in addition to strengthening the armed forces of Ukraine, NATO will also provide its guarantees. And now we are working together, Ukraine, the Europeans, and the United States, so that the security guarantees are of such a level that Vladimir Putin, sitting in Moscow, will never again attempt to attack Ukraine.
Right now, various options for security guarantees for Ukraine are being considered in Europe. According to Bloomberg, citing sources, the so-called Rapid Assistance Format, or NATO-like, has received the broadest support. This approach is being actively promoted by the Italian government. It stipulates that in the event of a provocation from Russia, the Allies will have 24 hours to discuss and then provide military and economic assistance to Kiev, including sanctions against the aggressor. At the same time, most European politicians emphasize that any concessions will be seen by Putin not as a compromise, but as a sign of weakness.
Putin cannot be trusted to keep any promises or commitments. That is precisely why security guarantees must be strong and reliable enough to prevent Russia from regrouping and launching a new attack. For its part, the EU will continue to take measures against Russia's military economy. Another package of sanctions against Moscow is expected to be ready as early as next month. I have made these issues a top priority on the agenda for discussions with the EU foreign and defense ministers. Kaja Kallas, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, on social network X.
U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio confirmed that Washington will participate in providing security guarantees for Ukraine. However, Europe must take the lead in this matter. Rubio did not specify exactly what kind of assistance the United States is prepared to offer. But let me remind you, earlier, Donald Trump spoke about his willingness to provide air support to multinational forces in Ukraine. And strategically, the U.S. intends to stick to the principle of no security talks about Ukraine without Ukraine.
Absolutely. Security guarantees are something Ukraine has repeatedly and publicly called for. They want to be sure that something like this will never happen again, that Russia won't invade again in 2.5, 3, or 4 years, or at any time in the future. Ukrainians do not want to go back to that. They need the opportunity to rebuild their homeland and live their own lives. These are very reasonable demands. We are working on this, and the Russian side needs to understand that. As a sovereign state, Ukraine has the right to enter into alliances and security agreements with other countries.
After Lavrov's statements, as noted by Western media, the possibility of a meeting between the president of Ukraine and the head of the Kremlin is now up in the air. And it was precisely these negotiations that Donald Trump had been pushing for, even announcing them several times. But now, the Russian Foreign Ministry claims that such a summit supposedly requires lengthy preparation and coordination of many, many details. All of this looks like the usual tactic of stalling the process and buying time. Meanwhile, Russia will be bargaining, trying to secure concessions even before the meeting itself.